In chess, the endgame is often characterized by precise calculations, pawn promotions, and subtle maneuvering. In this video, however, we delve into a game where traditional endgame principles are challenged. Here, strategic sacrifices and dynamic attacks take center stage. In this game, Milan Vidmar trades queens early in the opening, simplifying the position and setting the stage for a drawish endgame. However, the game takes a dramatic turn. Mikhail Botvinnik, with limited forces, initiates a devastating sacrificial attack on the enemy king, demonstrating the power of strategic sacrifices in transforming a seemingly boring endgame position. Join me as we examine the most unusual endgame strategy in chess. Botvinnik starts with d4, Vidmar plays d5, and after knight f3, knight f6, c4 and e6, Botvinnik opts for the Catalan opening. g3, preparing the fianchetto of the bishop. Vidmar captures on c4, and to get his pawn back, Botvinnik gives a check from a4, also targeting the c4 pawn. Now the common move for black would have been knight d7, but instead, in our game, as Botvinnik writes, his 61-year-old opponent opts for the strategy of simplification. So he wants to exchange the queens early in the game and then probably exchange more pieces and make a draw. So instead of knight d7, black plays queen d7. Botvinnik, of course, gets his pawn back, and black forces the exchange of the queens by playing queen c6. Attacking the white queen, the queen cannot avoid the exchange. If the queen moves away, black would simply capture the bishop. But of course, Botvinnik doesn't capture on c6 himself, because that would let black develop the knight, bring the knight into play. So instead he defends his queen and lets his opponent exchange the queens, after which white gets a great knight on c4. After exchanging the queens, Vidmar exchanges a pair of minor pieces too. Bishop b4 check, bishop d2, bishop takes d2, and it might seem that we will witness a boring, drawish endgame. However, the opposite will be the case. It's hard to imagine at this point, but Botvinnik will initiate a devastating and imaginative attack on the black king. So let's see how he does that, step by step. So first, Botvinnik must capture the bishop. He can do it in 3 different ways. And as the main action in this game will be on the queen side, as white has a half-open file on the queen side, his bishop will also target black's queen side. Black also has a half-open file on the queen side. Botvinnik transfers his king's knight from the king side to the queen side and captures with the f-knight, and also opens the diagonal for his bishop. Vidmar develops the knight with a tempo, attacking the pawn. Botvinnik defends the pawn, and now black's main problem is his bad bishop, which is restricted by its own pawn, while white, of course, will have a great bishop. The fianchettoed bishop will put a lot of pressure on the long diagonal, so black would love to exchange his bishop for white's bishop. For this reason, Vidmar plays knight b4, vacating the c6 square for his bishop. He's going to reroute the bishop to c6. Besides that, he has created an unpleasant threat, knight c2 check with a fork. And if white prevents the fork by playing rook c1, which looks like the most natural move, of course that would be a blunder, because black knight would capture on a2. But as the queens have been exchanged, and as we are heading towards an endgame, and probably it's already an endgame, and in endgame kings belong in the center of the board, Botvinnik prevents the threat of knight c2 by playing king e2. And now it doesn't make any sense to invade c2. So Vidmar, of course, plays bishop d7, and after bishop g2 he offers the exchange of the second pair of minor pieces. And if these bishops are exchanged, the position would become almost dead draw. And if white wants to play for a victory, he needs to avoid this exchange. But if he does that in the most natural way, by playing e4, that would be a blunder, because the d4 pawn wouldn't be protected anymore, and this time knight c2 would make perfect sense with the double attack, and white is losing material. For this reason, as e4 doesn't work, Botvinnik plays f3. which at first sight might look a little bit dubious, because by playing f3, Botvinnik voluntarily closes his bishop's diagonal. However, f3 has a very deep idea. By playing f3, Botvinnik takes under control the e4 square and prepares the advance of his e-pawn to e4, after which he will have a very strong pawn center, and these pawns will control all central squares and cramp black's pieces. Besides that, when the e3 pawn moves to e4, the e3 square will be vacated for the king, and the king will move even closer to the center. So, by playing f3, Botvinnik also completely restricted the f6 knight, so Vidmar plays knight d7. Probably he's going to play knight b6 and again offer the exchange of minor pieces. Botvinnik kicks the knight out of b4, and after knight d5 occupies the center with a tempo, e4. And the knight retreats to b6, again offering the exchange of pieces. As you see, black is already quite cramped. White controls the central squares and has a space advantage. And when you have a space advantage, of course, you should avoid the exchange of pieces, because every exchange will bring your opponent some relief. So, of course, Botvinnik avoids the exchange of the knights. Instead, he makes a very strong move, knight a5. Threatening to capture on c6, demolishing black's pawn structure on the queen side, after which black will have doubled and an isolated pawn. Besides that, the knight is targeting the b7 pawn. So black must avoid the exchange on c6, so he plays bishop b5 check. Of course, the king moves to e3, and now the b7 pawn is under attack. Besides that, the c7 pawn will also fall under attack on the half-open c-file. For this reason, Vidmar castles queenside and defends both of these weaknesses with his king. And now we can see the idea, one of the main ideas of knight a5. By playing knight a5 and targeting the b7 pawn, Botvinnik induced his opponent to castle queenside. And on the queenside, the king will become a target of attack. Although at the moment, again, it's hard to imagine how Botvinnik is going to initiate an attack. First, he should occupy the half-open c-file, and the most natural move would be rook c1. However, there is a stronger move. As the main action will be on the queenside, Botvinnik needs his rook on the a-file. So the rook will support the advance of the a-pawn, while the h-rook isn't doing anything on the king side. So instead of rook a c1, Botvinnik plays rook h c1, putting pressure on the c-file. So black is cramped, and in cramped positions you should try to exchange the pieces, and that was black's initial strategy. So he keeps playing in accordance with his strategy. He plays knight b8. With the idea of knight c6 and exchanging a pair of knights and getting rid of the annoying a5 knight. Botvinnik plays b3, taking under control the squares and restricting black pieces even more. Now these two squares are inaccessible for the knight and the bishop, and even more important, by playing b3, Botvinnik prepares the advance of the a-pawn. So he's going to squeeze black even more. So, before starting an attack on the king, he must deprive his opponent of any counter chances and completely squeeze his pieces. And it turns out that the intended knight c6 would be a mistake. It would be a blunder, because now that the pawn is on b3, white would play a4, attacking the bishop, and if the bishop retreats, of course, white would demolish the pawn structure and win a pawn, and if instead of retreating, black captures on a5, then white would capture the piece, and it turns out the knight would be trapped and it would be lost, so white would be up a piece in this case. For this reason, after b3, as immediate knight c6 doesn't work, Vidmar retreats his bishop to d7, and now of course a4 would follow without a tempo, and black is going to play knight c6 next move. So all white pieces are on the queen side, all except the bishop. The bishop's diagonal, of course, is barricaded by its own pawns. So Botvinnik improves the bishop, bishop f1. Now the bishop is targeting black's queen side too. And of course knight c6 followed. Now Botvinnik exchanges the knights, and after bishop takes c6, he plays a4, creating an immediate threat of a5 with the tempo, and after the retreat of the knight, a6, after which he's going to capture on b7, opening the a file, creating two isolated pawns on black's queen side, and both of these pawns would turn into a target of attack. And it's very important that after a5 and a6, black cannot keep the queen side closed by playing b6. He would love to play b6, but the pawn must keep an eye on the bishop. If black plays b6, once the white pawn appears on a6, of course the white rook would capture the bishop. For this reason, in order to be able to keep the queen side closed in the anticipation of a5, a6, Vidmar again retreats his bishop to e8. Now the pawn doesn't need to defend the bishop. And of course a5, so expanding and squeezing black even more. The knight is restricted, it cannot move to the active squares. The only squares it has are d7 and a8. At first sight, of course, black must play knight d7. That would be a natural move. However, after that, black would have difficulties in defending the c7 pawn. In this case, after a6, black must keep the queen side closed by playing b6. Rook c3, white would double on the c-file, and black would have difficulties in holding this pawn. For example, if black plays king b8, vacating the c8 square for the rook to defend the c7 pawn, after rook c1, rook c8, white can play knight c4, threatening knight d6, attacking the rook. And of course, black won't be able to capture in this case, because the rook on c8 would fall. And knight d6 is a very unpleasant threat, so black can play rook d8, preventing knight d6, but in this case, knight a3 would follow, again attacking c7, and after rook c8, defending it, white would attack the pawn for the third time, and white would win material. For this reason, as knight d7 doesn't work, black is forced to make an ugly move, knight a8. But Vidmar is going to play c6, vacating the c7 square for the knight, and bring the knight back into play via this square. So Botvinnik of course plays a6, black must keep the queen side closed, b6 followed, and now white controls the b7 square on the square on black's territory, so black is even more squeezed. As you see, all black pieces are placed on the 8th rank, but Botvinnik continues his expansion. He wants to maximize, to increase the squeeze until its maximum, so he plays b4. Now if black plays the intended c6 in order to bring the knight back into play, white would exploit the fact that the black king is on the c-file and the pawn is pinned. So white can play bishop b5, attacking the pawn for the second time, and the only way to hold the pawn would be king c7, and on c7 of course the king would occupy the knight's square, and the knight would turn into a terrible, even more terrible piece without any prospects, and white can either increase the pressure on the c-pawn by doubling his rooks, or even play more aggressively by sacrificing a piece but getting it back right away after b5, followed by rook takes c6. In both cases, white would be much better. For this reason, before playing c6, black moves his king away from the c-file, king b8. And here Botvinnik makes the only inaccurate move in this game. He should have played b5 right away, completely paralyzing and blockading black's position, after which black won't be able to play c6 anymore, because white would simply capture on c6. But instead of this, instead of b5, Botvinnik plays rook c3, vacating the c1 square for the second rook in order to increase the pressure on the c-file. But now, of course, black can play c6. And it turns out that now white cannot play b5 anymore, because black would simply capture this pawn. So Botvinnik plays rook c1, increasing the pressure. And it turns out that, again, if black plays the intended knight c7, this time white, as the knight is on c7, white can play b5. So, as the knight is on c7, black cannot capture with the pawn because he would lose this knight. He would be forced to capture with the knight, but in this case, after bishop takes b5, c takes b, the white rook invades the 7th rank with terrible threat of rook b7 check, followed by rook c7, and both white rooks invade the 7th rank, and that of course would be deadly. White would eliminate the a7 pawn, followed by rook c b7 check, followed by rook a8 checkmate. That would be simply devastating. So, for this reason, black doesn't play knight c7. Instead, in the anticipation of possible centralization of the white knight via c4 to e5, from e5 the knight would attack the c6 pawn for the 3rd time, Vidmar plays f6, simply a waiting strategy and reinforcing his position, taking under control the e5 square. And although black is completely squeezed, it might seem that black successfully defended his weaknesses and there are no ways for white to increase the pressure. And Vidmar in this position even offered a draw. However, Botvinnik declined a draw. So now, after completely squeezing his opponent, Botvinnik needs to find a way to increase his initiative. And the only way of doing that is to play b5. But at the moment it doesn't work, because black would simply capture it. White has only one piece controlling the b5 square. He needs to control this square, to attack this square one more time with the knight. That's why he plays knight b1, intending knight a3, and from a3 the knight will control this square, after which white will play b5. Black doesn't have any active plan, so he plays bishop d7, and of course knight a3, threatening b5, which will be very unpleasant. After this, of course, the c-file would open, and the pressure on the c-file would reach its maximum. So black must do something about this threat. But what can he do? If he prevents the white pawn from moving to b5 by playing b5 himself, he would terribly weaken the c5 and a5 squares, and white can reroute his knight via b1, d2 to b3, and from b3 the knight might jump either to c5 or to a5, attacking the c6 for the 3rd time, and white would get a strategically winning position. What else? b5 doesn't work. If black tries to challenge white's domination of the c-file by playing rook c8, then Botvinnik prepared knight c4, and next move the knight will invade d6 with a tempo, after which white will play e5, defending his knight and creating a great immortal outpost on d6. For this reason, to prevent the possible b5, Vidmar makes the most natural move, knight c7. Now black controls the b5 square 3 times. And we have reached a critical position. Again, it might seem that black has defended successfully and solved all his problems, and there is no way for white to increase his initiative. So now you can pause the video and try to find how Botvinnik did that. So, in order to open the c-file for his rooks, Botvinnik sacrifices a pawn and still plays b5. Black cannot capture with the pawn because he would lose the knight, so he must capture with the knight. And now, of course, bishop takes b5 followed, and after c takes b, black is up a pawn, but white invades the 7th rank. Rook c7 with a terrible threat of rook b7 check, which would lead to a checkmate. For example, if black doesn't take measures against rook b7 check and plays, let's say, b4, attacking the knight, after rook b7 check, king a8, the second rook invades c7, and white is threatening checkmate in 3 moves. For example, if black captures the knight, rook a7, rook b7, followed by rook a8, checkmate would fall. So after rook c7, as b takes a doesn't work, black would be forced to play bishop c8, taking under control the b7 square, but again that would lead to checkmate after rook takes a7 check and knight b5. So white is threatening deadly rook b7 check. For example, let's say black makes a random move, rook g8. After rook b7 check, white sacrifices the exchange, and after rook takes b7 check, no matter where the king moves, if to c8 it would get checkmated from a7, and if to a8 from c7. In both cases the king gets checkmated in one move. So what to do now after rook c7? White must do something against the threat of a deadly threat of rook b7 check. And the only way to prevent that would be bishop c8, taking under control the b7 square. In this case, of course, white would still be better after knight takes b5, bishop takes a6, knight takes a7. Now white is threatening to capture, followed by knight c6 with a fork, but black can play bishop b7. Now the knight is under attack. And after knight b5, white would be, of course, better, but only slightly better. Black can continue the resistance. But instead of this, instead of bishop c8, Vidmar makes a more natural move. Of course, white's total domination of the c file, of the only open file, is very unpleasant. So instead of bishop c8, black plays rook c8, challenging white's domination of the c file, and threatening simply to capture on c7 and win a rook. So white must do something about this threat. Of course, capturing on c8 would be a terrible mistake, because white would lose all his advantage, and it will be black who would play for victory after this. After knight takes b5, black would capture on a6, black would be up a pawn, he would have two connected passed pawns and a bishop against the knight, so black is winning in this case. Of course, Botvinnik didn't do that. Of course, after rook c8, he didn't exchange on c8. First, he plays rook b7 check, forcing the black king to move to the corner of the board. But now his rook is under attack. And one more time, if Botvinnik makes the obvious move, rook takes c8, check, after bishop takes c8, white can capture on g7, but black would eliminate the a6 pawn, defend his own pawn, the pawn would move forward, and black would have an advantage. So, how to increase the initiative? How to maintain it and even increase it? Botvinnik finds a sophisticated way of doing that. He, after sacrificing a pawn, he sacrifices the exchange. He captures on d7, eliminating the important bishop, the bishop which was defending the b5 pawn, and keeping his domination of the 7th rank, and letting his opponent capture on c1. Now black is up the exchange. But it turns out that after knight takes b5, the rook coordinates with the knight very well, so the a7 pawn is doomed, g7 pawn will also fall, and the a6 pawn also takes part in the attack, creating terrible threats to the black king. So, what is the threat? In case black defends the g7 pawn by playing rook g8, then rook takes a7 check would follow, king b8, rook b7 check. Now, if the king moves to a8, then of course knight c7 check, and black would be forced to return the exchange, after which white gets an absolutely winning position. And if instead of king a8 the king moves to c8, then knight a7 check, followed by rook b8 check, and black is losing the rook. So to prevent this, to save the rook, black plays rook c8. Now his rooks are connected and they defend each other. But Botvinnik simply captures on g7, he isn't in a hurry to capture on a7, this pawn is doomed anyways, and he is also attacking h7, black saves the pawn. Now Botvinnik captures on a7 with a check. After king b8, Botvinnik repeats moves to reach the time control, and after king a8, now Botvinnik cannot repeat moves anymore, but it turns out that black is completely paralyzed. His king cannot move. His rooks cannot leave the c-file. if any of the rooks leaves the c-file, knight c7 check would follow, and black would be forced to give up the exchange, return the exchange. If black tries to challenge the white rook and exchange it by playing rook b8, that would be a terrible blunder because of checkmate in one move. So black simply doesn't have any moves, and for this reason Botvinnik isn't in a hurry to capture on b6. This pawn is doomed anyways, and he doesn't want to capture this pawn, after which he would lose the domination of the 7th rank. He wants to keep his rook on the 7th rank for as long as possible. So instead of capturing on b6, he improves his position. He plays g4. The idea is to take under control the h5 square, fixing the h-pawn. Now this pawn cannot move, and Botvinnik is going to push the h-pawn to h5, and on h5 the pawn will be very close to the promotion square, after which white can eliminate the black h-pawn, after which his pawn will move forward. And Vidmar understands that he cannot just sit and wait, while his opponent simply gradually improves his position. So he must do something, and Vidmar finds the only way, the desperate attempt to kick the knight out of b5. So he plays e5 in order to deflect the pawn from d4, and on d4 the pawn controls the c5 square, and after the pawn is deflected he will play rook c5 and kick the knight out of b5. But of course by playing e5, Vidmar lets his opponent create a protected passed pawn. And after d5, of course, he plays rook c5, attacking the knight. Botvinnik repeats the position one more time. After rook b7 check king a8, now that his rook has completed its mission on the 7th rank, white has created a protected passed pawn. Now he finally eliminates the b6 pawn. And black finally manages to get rid of this terrible rook, which tortured him for such a long time. And white must exchange the rooks, and after king takes b8, black is up the exchange, but for the exchange white has 3 pawns. And two of them are passed pawns. Botvinnik plays a7 check. If king moves to a8, then d6 would follow, and white is threatening to promote. Black cannot capture the knight because of d7, and the pawn would be unstoppable. So after d6, black would be forced to play rook c8, trying to stop the pawn, but in this case after king d3, king b7, knight c7, closing the c-file and threatening to promote. So black must capture the knight, but now that the file is closed, the king can move to c4, followed by king d5, king e6, the king would be greatly placed, the f6 pawn would fall, after which white will create the second passed pawn, and black of course would lose. For this reason, after a7, instead of king a8, black plays king b7, but now he loses the f6 pawn right away. After knight d6 check, king must capture, knight e8, and there is no way to defend the pawn. King b6, knight takes f6, rook c3 check, king f2, rook c7, and now that the f6 pawn has disappeared, of course Botvinnik creates the second passed pawn, h4 followed by g5. Rook f7 attacking the knight, knight h5, king c7, g5, h takes. Now white is threatening to push the pawn forward and promote. That's why rook h7 attacking the knight, knight f6. Black cannot play rook g7 because of the fork. That's why he plays rook h2 check, hoping to stop the pawn from behind. After king g3, rook h1, black is ready to play rook g1, but king g2, of course Botvinnik prevents that, and after rook h8, g6, white is threatening g7 and promote to the queen, and the only way to stop that would be rook h6, but in this case still white would play g7. If black captures the knight, of course white promotes, and if rook g6 check, king f2, rook takes g7, again the fork would follow. So for this reason, after g6 in this position, black resigned. And now I recommend watching how Mikhail initiated a devastating attack after the exchange of queens. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.